Her ambitions were not as crude as Mrs. Bart's. It had been among the lady's grievances that her husband, in the early days before he was too tired, had wasted his evenings in what she vaguely described as reading poetry, and among the effects packed off to auction after his death were a score or two of dingy volumes which had struggled for existence among the boots and medicine bottles of his dressing-room shelves. There was in Lily a vein of sentiment, perhaps transmitted from this source, which gave an idealizing touch to her most prosaic purposes. She liked to think of her beauty as a power for good, as giving her the opportunity to attain a position where she should make her influence felt in the vague diffusion of refinement and good taste. She was fond of pictures and flowers, and of sentimental fiction, and she could not help thinking that the possession of such tastes ennobled her desire for worldly advantages. She would not, indeed, have cared to marry a man who was merely rich. She was secretly ashamed of her mother's crude passion for money. Lily's preference would have been for an English nobleman with political ambitions and vast estates, or, for second choice, an Italian prince with a castle in the Apennines and an hereditary office in the Vatican. Lost causes had a romantic charm for her, and she liked to picture herself as standing aloof from the vulgar pass of the Quirinal, and sacrificing her pleasure to the claims of an immemorial tradition. How long ago and far off it all seemed! Those ambitions were hardly more futile and childish than the earlier ones which had centered about the possession of a French jointed doll with real hair. Was it only 10 years since she had wavered in imagination between the English earl and the Italian prince? Restlessly, her mind travelled on over the dreamy interval. After 2 years of hungry roaming, Miss Bart had died of a deep disgust. She hated dinginess, and it was her fate to be dingy. Her visions of a brilliant marriage for Lily had faded after the first year. People can't marry you if they don't see you, and how can they see you in these holes where we're stuck? That was the burden of her lament, and her last adjuration to her daughter was to escape from dinginess if she could. Don't let it creep up on you and drag you down. Fight your way out of it somehow. You're young and can do it, she insisted. She had died during one of their brief visits to New York, and there Lily at once became the center of a family council composed of the wealthy relatives whom she had been taught to despise for living like pigs. It may be that they had an inkling of the sentiments in which she had been brought up, for none of them manifested a very lively desire for her company. Indeed, the question threatened to remain unsolved till Mrs. Penson, with a sigh, announced, "I'll try her for a year." Everyone was surprised, but one and all concealed their surprise, lest Miss Penson should be alarmed by it into reconsidering her decision. Miss Penson was Mr. Bart's widowed sister, and if she was by no means the richest of the family group, its other members nevertheless abounded in reasons why she was clearly destined by Providence to assume the charge of Lily. In the first place, she was alone, and it would be charming for her to have a young companion. Then she sometimes travelled, and Lily's familiarity with foreign customs, deplored as a misfortune by her more conservative relatives, would at least enable her to act as a kind of courier. But, as a matter of fact, Miss Penson had not been affected by these considerations. She had taken the girl simply because no one else would have her, and because she had the kind of moral mauvaise honte which makes the public display of selfishness difficult, though it does not interfere with its private indulgence. It would have been impossible for Mrs. Penson to be heroic on a desert island, but with the eyes of her little world upon her, she took a certain pleasure in her act. She reaped the reward to which disinterest is entitled, and found an agreeable companion in her niece. She had expected to find Lily headstrong, critical, and foreign, for even Miss Penson, though she occasionally went abroad, had the family dread of foreignness, but the girl showed a pliancy which, to a more penetrating mind than her aunt's, might have been less reassuring than the open selfishness of youth. Misfortune had made Lily supple instead of hardening her, and a pliable substance is less easy to break than a stiff one. Miss Penson, however, did not suffer from her niece's adaptability. Lily had no intention of taking advantage of her aunt's good nature. She was, in truth, grateful for the refuge offered her. Miss Penson's opulent interior was at least not externally dingy, but dinginess is a quality which assumes all manner of disguises, and Lily soon found that it was as latent in the expensive routines of her aunt's life as in the makeshift existence of a continental pension. Miss Penson was one of the episodical persons who formed the padding of life. It was impossible to believe that she herself had ever been a focus of activities. The most vivid thing about her was the fact that her grandmother had been a Van Alstyne. This connection with the well-fed and industrious stock of early New York revealed itself in the glacial neatness of Miss Penson's drawing-room and in the excellence of her cuisine. She belonged to the class of old New Yorkers who have always lived well, dressed expensively, and done little else, and to these inherited obligations Miss Penson faithfully conformed. She had always been a looker-on at life, and her mind resembled one of those little mirrors which her Dutch ancestors were accustomed to affix to their upper windows, so that from the depths of an impenetrable domesticity they might see what was happening in the street. Miss Penson was the owner of a country place in New Jersey, but she had never lived there since her husband's death, a remote event which appeared to dwell in her memory chiefly as a dividing point in the personal reminiscences that formed the staple of her conversation. She was a woman who remembered dates with intensity, and could tell at a moment's notice whether the drawing-room curtains had been renewed before or after Mr. Penson's last illness. Mrs. Penson thought the country lonely and trees damp, and cherished a vague fear of meeting a bull. To guard against such contingencies, she frequented the more populous watering places, where she installed herself impersonally in a hired house and looked on at life through the matted screen of her veranda. In the care of such a guardian, it soon became clear to Lily that she was to enjoy only the material advantages of good food and expensive clothing, and, though far from underrating these, she would gladly have exchanged them for what Mrs. Bart had taught her to regard as opportunities. She sighed to think what her mother's fierce energies would have accomplished had they been coupled with Miss Penson's resources. Lily had an abundant energy of her own, but it was restricted by the necessity of adapting herself to her aunt's habits. She saw that at all costs she must keep Mrs. Penson's favor till, as Miss Bart could have phrased it, she could stand on her own legs. Lily had no mind for the vagabond life of the poor relation, and to adapt herself to Miss Penson she had, to some degree, to assume that lady's passive attitude. She had fancied at first that it would be easy to draw her aunt into the whirl of her own activities, but there was a static force in Miss Penston against which her niece's efforts spent themselves in vain. To attempt to bring her into active relation with life was like tugging at a piece of furniture which had been screwed to the floor. She did not, indeed, expect Lily to remain equally immovable. She had all the American guardian's indulgence for the validity of youth. She had indulgence also for certain other habits of her niece's. It seemed to her natural that Lily should spend all her money on dress, and she had supplemented the girl's scanty income by occasional handsome presents, meant to be applied to the same purpose. Lily, who was intensely practical, would have preferred a fixed allowance, but Miss Penson liked the periodical recurrences of gratitude evoked by unexpected checks, and was perhaps shrewd enough to perceive that such a method of giving kept alive in her niece a salutary sense of dependence. Beyond this, Miss Penson had not felt called upon to do anything for her charge. She had simply stood aside and let her take the field. Lily had taken it, at first with the confidence of assured possessorship, then with gradually narrowing demands, till now she found herself actually struggling for a foothold on the broad space which had once seemed her own for the asking. How it had happened she did not yet know. Sometimes she thought it was because Mrs. Penson had been too passive, and again she feared it was because she herself had not been passive enough. Had she shown an undue eagerness for victory? Had she lacked patience, pliancy, and dissimilitude? Whether she charged herself with these faults or absolved herself from them made no difference in the sum total of her failure. Younger and plainer girls had been married off by the dozens, and she was 29, and still Mrs. Bart. She was beginning to have fits of angry rebellion against fate when she longed to drop out of the race and make an independent life for herself. But what manner of life would it be? She had barely enough money to pay her dressmaker's bills and her gambling debts, and none of the desultory interests which she dignified with the name of taste was pronounced enough to enable her to live contentedly in obscurity. Ah, no, she was too intelligent not to be honest with herself. She knew that she hated dinginess as much as her mother had hated it, and to her last breath she meant to fight against it, dragging herself up again and again above its flood till she gained the bright pinnacles of success which presented such a slippery surface to her clutch. End of chapter 3.